So one of the most horrific things ever in the history of ever has to be the surgeon's room during naval combat in around the 18th century, where the screams of the wounded and dying rang out, and those who witnessed it often described it as a vision of hell. The surgeon would be situated on the orlop deck or the lowest deck possible where no natural light got through, and any light emitted by the flickering candles was focused on the surgeon, who had to make assessments on wounded sailors in almost pitch black. Before battle begun, sand would be spread across the floor to help the surgeon keep his footing, as once blood began to drip from the wounded, and during surgeries it would have been a challenge not to slip over. At the Battle of Trafalgar in 1805, there was still no concept of hygiene or sterilisation, so a quick wipe on the surgeon's bloody apron would be enough to use his instruments again, only changing when the ones he was using were blunt. Anaesthesia also wasn't a thing until 1846, so if someone needed a limb removed, speed was the key to success, as a patient could often go into deep shock if the surgery took too long, as the surgeon cut through their bone, often vibrating their whole body, which could prove fatal if the limb amputation wasn't already in the first place. If amputation was required, the patient would get a swig of rum or brandy, as well as a leather gag to bite down on, with a tourniquet applied to the area as the surgeon cut from the flesh all the way through to the bone, with some surgeons being able to do this in one swift motion, while others required a few cuts. A limb could be removed in under a minute by skilled surgeons, and the whole stitch-up process done in two, in what would seem as a lifetime to the patients, and then the limb would be collected in a bucket and taken up to the top decks and thrown overboard. The surgeons did operate on a first-come, first-served basis, placing them under immense pressure to work as fast as possible, with each wounded being given only a few seconds to have an assessment made in extremely poor lighting. Men often bled to death waiting their turn to see the surgeon, whose wounds were not fatal and just required a bit of treatment, and while tourniquets and bandaging was taught to ship's crews, their first aid was usually lacking in the heat of battle. The dark, confined space where the surgeon was hot and airless, and the stench of blood, sweat and mangled flesh was not being ventilated properly, and with every surface shaking as cannons pounded off above them, it was no wonder it was described as hell. So one of the greatest displays of bravery ever witnessed on the battlefield has to be the 27th Inniskillings at the Battle of Waterloo, who suffered absolutely horrendous casualties at the hands of Napoleon's artillery. The Inniskillings were an Irish regiment made up of around 750 men and were part of Wellington's reserve, taking their place on the battlefield around 1,000 metres behind the main line at around 11 o'clock just as the battle was beginning. They had an exhausting march through a horrendous and rainy night, where some men were sleeping at the start of the battle even through all the noise, and they were taking stray bullets from fire that had gone through the front lines, and they would remain in position till around 3 o'clock. Wellington's centre had been absolutely battered by the French army, and he called his reserves forward about 3 o'clock in the day, and the Inniskillings took position just here where the two roads met on the corner. It was an absolutely key location for Wellington, and the geography is vitally important to understanding how much they endured. They had the 4th and 40th regiments slightly behind them, and they were defended from artillery fire from this ridge running along it. However, the 27th were at the highest position and were exceptionally exposed. Their only reprieve was this slightly sunken road in front of them, which offered protection from cavalry charges from their front and right flank. However, the French cavalry still managed to circle around and still pepper at the 27th, but it was mostly the 40th that took the brunt of the cavalry charges. It was the artillery fire which absolutely battered the 27th though, with them taking casualties from alternative cavalry charges and then cannonball fire, and they even welcomed the cavalry charges as it gave them all a break from all the cannonballs that were flying at them. Cannons could absolutely rip a man apart limb from limb, and these men could hear the horrifying screams of their dying comrades next to them, and they could see the cannon shots firing from across the battlefield as they reloaded, and they still stood their ground, holding Wellington's centre. They endured around 3 hours of horrendous artillery fire before the French troops finally took the farm of La Haye-Sainte, and they stopped firing due to fear of hitting their own men. They then endured sharpshooters from the farm, as well as the French infantry advancing onto them, while the Inniskillings all remained in a defensive square out of a fear of a cavalry charge, meaning they were easy pickings. The horror of their day came to an end after around 5 hours of hell, after Wellington sounded the general advance at around 8 o'clock, with the French in retreat, and 500 of the original 750 Inniskillings were wounded or killed, and they made a square of dead where they stood. A captured French general was reported as saying, "I have seen Russian, Prussian and French bravery, but anything equal to the stubborn bravery of the regiment with castles, I have never witnessed." The bravery of the 27th Inniskillings in holding their position and holding the line, despite the absolute horrors they face, was crucial in Wellington's victory, with him remarking later, "They saved the centre of my line, and had they retreated, the battle could have gone entirely differently." So medieval battles were usually extremely bloody affairs, soldiers on both sides becoming possessed beasts as they tried to destroy opposing armies. The capture of prisoners during these battles would have been an extremely enticing concept, as ransoms for some important captives could reach up to a year's wages or even more for some soldiers. In theory, if someone important was disarmed or captured during the battle, they would play no further part in the fighting and their life would be secure. However, this wouldn't always be the case, as sometimes these prisoners were massacred in the heat of battle, such as during the Battle of Agincourt. The savagery of the battle saw bodies lying in heaps, with some even as tall as a man. Many of them were actually alive, prevented from rising due to the weight of their armour. While some were dispatched for a knife through their helmet visor, others were pulled out and taken as captives and sent to the back ranks. A lull in the 3-hour-long fighting seemed to mark an astonishing victory for the English, where they had captured roughly 1,500 to 2,000 prisoners, but at this point, no one is sure exactly what happened next. At some point during the battle, cries went up that the English baggage train that was situated behind them came under attack, and also that the French third line was now regrouping for a counterattack. The valiant English victory was now threatened with defeat, as they were exhausted, out of formation, and vulnerable to a fresh charge. King Henry V now made a call that would have been unheard of at the time, that all French prisoners, bar the most important, were to be massacred. Henry's immediate concern was that the prisoners still in full armour would overwhelm their guards, pick up weapons off the floor, and join in on the counterattack. Henry's knights were absolutely horrified and refused, firstly due to chivalrous code, and mainly due to the thought of the ransom money they could get out of these captured men. Henry was not deterred by this refusal and ordered 200 of his archers to execute these prisoners under pain of execution. The French prisoners who had surrendered to guarantee their life were now brutally massacred as their throats were slit or burnt alive in the buildings they were being held captive in. Even by 15th century standards, Henry's massacre of prisoners was an extremely nasty crime under the laws of chivalry. Whether it was a tactical move or done in cold blood, Henry's massacre had paid off, as the French now fled their field as they saw their prisoners being massacred, and he had won a great victory on the fields of Agincourt. So some of the greatest bravery witnessed during combat has to be from the naval officers commanding their ships, who often had an exaggerated disregard for their own safety, leading from the front in order to inspire their men. As cannonballs, musket balls and splinters flew out all around them, with sailors screaming in agony if one of their limbs was taken off, officers made it a point of pride to walk around the top decks, exposed to all sorts of threats, without even flinching at the incoming danger. While the most famous is of course Lord Nelson, who at the Battle of Trafalgar in 1805 took a fatal shot to a sharpshooter while patrolling the top decks, the French also took this to extremes 7 years prior at the Battle of the Nile. Admiral Broyes, who was commanding the French fleet, was wounded in the head before he had both his legs taken off by a round shot, but he was not to be deterred from leading his men. He ordered his men to strap him into an armchair on the top decks, with tourniquets applied to both stumps to stop the bleeding, while he continued to issue orders before finally he was cut in half by another cannonball. Further down the French line, Admiral du Petit Thomas first lost his right arm, and then his left, and then his leg was taken off by a cannonball, but 'tis but a scratch to him, and instead of going down to the lower decks, he ordered his men to prop him up in a barrel filled with wheat. He eventually succumbed to the blood loss while giving orders to his men, but one of his last was to nail the French flag to the mast, which is a naval signal to fight to the last man and let the ship sink before surrendering to the enemy. Despite the bravery shown by both admirals, and I imagine countless many other sailors, the British did eventually take the day at the Battle of the Nile, allowing them vital control of the Mediterranean. So one of the most horrific things ever in the history of ever has to have been being a galley slave, with the conditions they had to face being unpleasant to say the least, and it was usually a drawn out, prolonged, painful death sentence. The galley was the war machine of the Mediterranean Sea, fantastically agile and able to close close distances at remarkable speed compared to the sail ship. However, it also required a vast amount of manpower to work all the oars, something that professional rowers did in the ancient Mediterranean world. However, by the time the 16th century rolled around and the Holy Roman Empire and the Ottoman Empire fought for control of the sea, it was primarily prisoners of war and convicts who worked the oars on the galleys, not leaving this position for months on end and chained up, and if they did manage to get freedom, it would usually be to be chucked in a giant cage together. They rowed themselves to death to the beat of their drums and their masters' lashes, and their diets done little to help as they were only fed small quantities of rock-solid biscuits and barely any water, with some so thirsty they resorted to drinking the salted seawater beneath them. They had to shit where they sat, and the only protection they had against the scorching Mediterranean sun was some tiny linen breeches, as their burnt bodies were whipped to exhaustion when galleys needed to be at full speed. The stench would have been absolutely unbearable, with contemporaries mentioning you could smell these things 2 miles off, and disease absolutely riddled the vessels, being able to wipe out crews in a matter of weeks. The ship's hulls were periodically sunk under the water level to clear out all the shit and rats, and if any of these actually managed to survive to a battle, they were chained up where they stood, and they had to hide under these benches where they sat, often awaiting the fate of the ship, which they couldn't escape if it sunk, or killed by their own countrymen. Slaves were often sentenced to 10 years plus on the galleys, however they rarely, if ever, actually made it that far, and if they did, no one would actually care except the slaves themselves, so it's highly unlikely they would have been released. The galleys chewed through men at an alarming rate, where raiding enemy towns to capture more slaves was commonplace, in a situation where raiding was undertaken so more said raids could occur in a vicious cycle as galleys created their own need for war.